Thank you everyone for waiting, and thank you everyone for joining. We're all, and especially thank you to all our dear speakers and all the people that show interest in, for many people, in so warm a month. And thank you for coming here to this interesting discussion. I'm Federico, I'm the IMF campaign manager at Recourse, and the reason I'll do a short introduction before introducing our speakers. The reason why I'm here and the discussion that we want to have is around the IMF and climate justice. Why is it that we are having this discussion again? If it's not the 80s and the 90s, it's because the IMF is back. Since the 2020 COVID crisis, as some of our speakers will mention later, the IMF is back in the field. It's present in more than 50 countries with programs that continue pushing austerity, that continue pushing for privatization. And increasingly the IMF, in a PR attempt to show itself as an institution that has changed, it has been stepping into climate discussions, and this has created concern by civil society, by various of our allies, and also from ourselves. So the idea of this discussion at all, and all the work that we've been doing on this topic, is to assess to what extent the IMF has changed the way in which it does things, or whether it's just greenwashing. And that's one of the main questions we try to answer in this new guide that we're going to publish and launch today in the format of a website. It gathers the work from various organizations, from various experts. It's been a huge joint effort led by Frederic here, to which I'm really, really grateful. And the idea today would be to go through the website, but also to give a little bit of a historical political background on the role of the IMF, share some experiences from what's happening in the countries which are under IMF programs, and also to provide both to climate advocates some ideas about how to get more involved in this work, and also for economic justice advocates to get an idea of how is it that this institution that you all will know is also negatively impacting countries' climate justice. So now I'll hand it over. We're going to have some introductory, like a keynote remark by Lara Merling. Then we're going to have a presentation of the website and the guide for you to familiarize with it. Then we're going to have 3 presentations from some of our colleagues and friends in Pakistan, in Argentina, and in Morocco. And then we're going to have Mariana presenting a little bit about how is it that IMF reform talks to other big policy processes. And we'll have time for questions and answers at the end. So please, if you have any question, any comment, anything you want to raise, you'll have time to do so. Please do so in the chats, and I can pick it up at the end. So I think now I'll introduce Lara Merling. She's a Romanian-American economist whose work bridges research and policy with a focus on economic governance, climate and development finance. She is a research fellow at the Climate and Community Institute. And she will be providing a presentation saying a little bit about how is it, what's the link between debt, climate, international financial architecture, the role the IMF plays there, the debt climate vicious circle, and also, I mean, who's the IMF and why is it that there may be concerns for its involvement in this topic? The floor is yours, Lara.
Hi, thank you everyone for joining. Thanks so much for organizing this too, and for the really good guide you put together, which is exciting to see, because as you're saying, this is a big topic and the IMF is very influential, and it's sometimes like hard to tell what it's doing in terms of climate, because a lot of like what it says might sound pretty good. So I am gonna try to touch on all those issues you mentioned in my time. So maybe going a little bit like quicker over things, but we'll have time for questions and answers. But just in terms of thinking, of the topic and that little history that Federico started mentioning, in at this point, almost a decade, we see more and more of like the IMF talking about climate change, talking about how it is aligned with its mandate, how it has a role in that, and kind of how it wants to be at this forefront of climate conversations. But this is a different, conversation from the way it still does country level programs, and where nothing has, really changed in how it's has everything around like macroeconomic discipline and market solutions, which is just really new ways of describing Washington consensus policies and like short sort of tweaks of that, but nothing fundamentally changed in like the modeling, the logic, and how these programs are creating. So in this approach, it means that, talking about climate and the need for climate finance just kind of becomes a new way for the IMF to justify and push the same type of policies and conditionalities and constraints. And where the model comes from is something that it's not just about the IMF, it's just in general like the orthodoxy in the economics profession. And we see that at the World Bank and other institutions, that it's this neoclassical sort of worldview where these assumptions about how things work are made, and about, kind of markets are efficient, the state is bad, and you get like these type of like things that are political but then are modeled as if they're neutral, and you come up with these like frameworks and policies that are all about, privatize everything, austerity. They don't like see, any role like for the state except for correcting market failures where they exist, and even then through like price signals and not as much like interventions. So this is kind of something that, as long as, this is the logic and how things are approached, it's very hard for institutions like the IMF to reach different policy conclusions. And it's also how, in some cases, and even with like climate and so on, they'll claim they're conceding that maybe there's a trade-off because you need to do something, but they will still arrive to conclusions to like this way of like thinking and framing and like modeling. And the question that we might all ask is, why do countries still go to the IMF, and why are countries going to the IMF again if it doesn't work? And that's where, we have this entire like track record of failures. We'll hear about country examples from now. We can start from like, the 1980s and like first structural adjustment programs. We can think of like the East Asian crisis, the Eurozone crisis. And even though like none of these like programs achieve their goals, there's like no accountability. And it's maybe, I mean, there actually is accountability, but just in the way the IMF is structured, its governance means that it's accountable to creditor countries and not to borrower countries. And for the borrower countries, they just can't really do anything about like how these programs like fail or make things worse. And the reason all of these countries that are going to the IMF have to is because, it kind of goes back to a bit more like abstract, bigger picture point of, we live in what is still mostly like a dollar-based world and financial architecture, where, what we can say is like, one of the terms that can be used is like financial subordination of countries in the global south, because most things are in dollars. So, for countries like the US, they issue dollars, then the countries that are other rich countries that are friends with the US have arrangements to get dollars. But for countries in the global south, mostly the way to get dollars is through exports, or then they have to like borrow in dollars. And when things like kind of like go bad in like the global system, like the Federal Reserve is the top central bank of the world, but they never really consider what's happening to the rest of the world due to their policies. So when they raise interest rates, it has an impact on everyone, but they don't consider that. And that's kind of how the countries at the bottom in the system have like these additional risks and vulnerabilities. And that's, going back, how they end up going to the IMF, which has, for them the role of lender of last resort. And then also because that's its role, it has this gatekeeper role in the entire financial architecture, where even when you're not directly in an IMF loan, you're still heavily incentivized to be aligned with what the IMF says, because they also do these like debt sustainability analysis. And here, for example, it's like some of the larger middle income countries, when things are good, they don't have to listen as much. And then they have the credit rating agency problem on how they can borrow externally. But even for those countries, the moment there's like any sort of crisis or shock in the system and they can't go to private markets and borrow, they have to come back to the IMF. So it just has this position of power, which means that even if it's failing and countries know it's going to fail or that the programs are not going to turn out well, it gets to a point where there's really little alternative to getting dollar loans. And that's the vicious cycle. This is from a paper that I worked on at CEPR with one of my colleagues there, where we have this illustration, and it's been done in many other contexts of how this architecture has this debt traps as a feature, and it puts countries in this vicious cycle because the loans are conditional. They come with policies and the types of reform that undermine growth and development. And then there's the aspect of, okay, what can countries export really quickly if they don't have time to like invest and develop higher value added exports. It's commodities, which are also harmful for the environment. um, but no matter like how much they do that, they're still trapped in this continuous cycle of debt underinvestment, and it makes it very hard to move past and also to invest in climate policy and adaptation things that kind of then make vulnerabilities a lot worse. um, and that's how what I said too, in like how the IMF sees the world. It translates to climate policy as market solutions, carbon pricing, green bonds, de-risking. These are the type of like concepts that are all on the idea that like countries need to just raise revenue for some things that's acknowledged that have to be done by public investment, but the rest is like the role of countries and governments is to make policies that attract foreign investors, and that everything has to be done in a way that caters, despite the decades of failure on the same concept on development, it's still extended to climate. Instead of an approach that, is the state-led industrial policy type approach, that is really what has worked on all large-scale structural transformations throughout history for most countries, but that goes against this like ideological frameworks of the IMF. And just one of the main pieces we see too is carbon pricing and pricing messengers. And part of why it's the kind of policy the IMF also adapts is because they have these models that they apply across countries. And this one is like a very easy one of you make a template where you put in some numbers and then you put it across for as many countries, and it doesn't really kind of get into like the details of those countries. And it's seen like in an austerity type program, like an easy way to, on paper at least, raise revenue, even though in practice too it's unclear how much revenue is actually raised through this type of um, policy. And this was an older joke and comic that was about the Washington consensus, but it really extends to climate policy. And just this idea of like for any country that goes to the IMF, no matter like what issue, what context, what happened, what was the shock, what caused the crisis, what are the specific problems in those countries, it always prescribes the exact same treatment. um, which to answer where we started from, it is fair to say that climate policy at the IMF is just calling structural adjustment policies green and using that language um, to make it sound better, and kind of repackaging spending cuts or additional taxes as climate policy. And it does really nothing to break away from what it's done before. It's just kind of like an addition to the same model and policies, and just something that they then get to like write in the text and start with like the IMF supports a just transition, but they will define that concept very differently than any of us or really any kind of reasonable person would define that. So just now, to wrap it up, is just that anything that the IMF says about climate, any research that it does, that it publishes, cannot be really separated from like the same macro frameworks and its country level policy, because there might be like a good paper it puts out there or like things it says in a statement, but those are not, the country level framework and policies that are applied. And that's a very important distinction too, that even if like, there might be things that sound good, it doesn't mean that that's like how they actually do policy, but that despite this, in the financial architecture that we have, because of this role of lender of last resort during crisis for the countries that are at the periphery of the system, it has all these influence, and it's, now, Federico said in 50 countries. So it's like all the places where it has programs, or like where countries think they might have to have a program, they do have to follow the IMF's advice. So that's why it's really important to engage with it, even though we would be able to say that, that they should have no place in climate because of how things work, they will have. So that's why, it matters to talk about these issues. And then, this is like another old illustration that was Washington Consensus related. But the question here too is like, what do we do so that climate doesn't become the next excuse that justifies the IMF going in and doing whatever it wants? Thank you.
Thank you so much, Lara. I think some of the quick takeaways that we can build up on later is, I think there's this huge discussion in the climate community on, what type of climate finance we want and what happens when climate finance is designed in a way that actually exacerbates financial subordination. And I think your explanation of the cycle, of the vicious cycle, shows what are the limitations of an approach to climate finance that actually accelerates financial subordination, and that the climate finance that we designed, the institutions should be actually addressing that and reverting it, not accelerating. I think with that, and then also I think we can build up on the point on like, why do countries continue going to the IMF and the alternatives? Because you have to think about alternatives also. Thank you so much. Now we're going to pass over to Frederica, my colleague, a finance campaigner at Recourse, a feminist economic justice advocate, researcher, facilitator, and has been working on economic and social rights impacts of IFIs for a long while now. She will be walking us through the website, which is excellent and really, really rich, thanks to all the inputs that allies and partners have provided. I'll hand it over to you because you can go through it better than I can.
Thank you so much, Fede, and give me a second as well to share my screen. So here we go. Well, in an ideal world, I would be presenting to you the actual campaign website, which is going to be at imf-climate.org. But as you can see, it still looks like that, thanks to our web developers. So hopefully by the end of the day, you'll actually be able to find the website at its intended home. In the meantime, I'm showing you what it's going to look like with a slightly different URL. And we also converted the same content into a guidebook. So if you're more of a PDF reading type person, you will also be able to find the content there. So maybe while listening to Lara, you were like, this is amazing. This is exactly what I'm doing 24/7. And you're already a mega expert on the IMF, or maybe, you're an economist and you don't really work on climate that much. Or maybe you do work on climate a lot and you don't really know that well, like how the IMF as an institution functions. So for that, we created this guide, which is kind of meant to be as a one-on-one starting point on everything that relates to the IMF and climate change. So you can go to your friends and family that have big question marks in their eyes when you tell them, oh, the IMF matters. And with this, hopefully you can convince them too. So I will just show you through the website really briefly to basically give you a taste of all the things you can find and read there. We have this landing page here, and I'm just going to scroll down the items here. You can see what is the IMF are also in the top. So that's basically just a starter explainer, pretty much what Lara just did, right? What is the IMF? Why does it matter? What is its role globally? Why should I care? In other words. And then on the second step, what does it have to do with climate? So if we look at that here in the top as well, we have a bit on the IMF and the Paris Agreement. So looking at some of the key tenets of the Paris Agreement, how do they relate to what the fund does, and how it influences, where the finance goes in relation to climate action. Then the IMF's own work on climate, which we know is relatively recent, and I think Lara gave a really good introduction to that. But if you want to have a deep dive into everything that the fund has done, and in particular its new lending facility, the Resilience and Sustainability Trust, which has kind of been its main instrument for defining its approach to climate through lending. And so we thought it was particularly interesting to highlight that, since the fund has kind of been working its climate work, like building the plane as it flies, through the development of the RST. So that's an important kind of micro lens into its thinking and into its development of the approach. And then we have right now 5 country cases, many of which you will actually hear from today, and where we are particularly grateful for the colleagues that are present today that really helped us develop these. So we have examples from Argentina, Ecuador, Egypt, Kenya, and Pakistan on the impacts of the fund in those countries, and in particular related to climate change. So I'm sure many of those will resonate, and putting it out there to our attendees, if there's folks also who have interesting case studies written up from your own countries, etc. There is a function on the page where you can submit resources that I will show you in a second, where we'd also really encourage you to submit your materials, and we'll try to upload them. We have a timeline of the IMF engagement on climate change. So that's kind of, again, a bit in relationship to its work on climate. And then very importantly, the question of what you can do about it, right? And so for that, we have a section on advocacy resources in particular. I'm going to go in there in a sec, with practical tips, as well as a bunch of different papers that we thought were particularly good to start reading about some of these issues. So also if you're like, I'm interested to learn a bit more about this like debt and climate vicious cycle that Lara was just showing, or just climate justice as a whole, and what does it have to do, or what is this private sector first approach? You can go there, and we uploaded a bunch of papers for each topic that we think is a good starting point to get into the issues more. And so I will actually jump there right now, and I want to show you 2 pieces of the website in particular, one being the civil society advocacy page. So this is kind of how the site is built up. It has lots of text, but each of it is hidden away well into these little drop downs, so you can basically jump to the header that is most relevant to you, as well as a bunch of some case studies in there, and then some other sections on, for example, expectations versus reality when it comes to IMF advocacy. The fund has some guidelines that are already 10 years old, as you can see here, and not mandatory, around how its staff is supposed to engage with civil society. And it's quite interesting to read through that, because a lot of the advice is not so bad if only everybody was taking it. But then, of course, there's also good research already out there from colleagues from Oxfam, for example, that looked at, okay, what actually happens when we do this, right? And for example, the fact that there's a strong imbalance of power between civil society and the IMF that we are very aware of, but fun stuff, not always. Anyway, so here you can basically find a lot of, practical tips, contacts, where to start looking basically for specific information and people, as well as advocacy strategies depending on where you are, right? So if you are at the global north level, quote unquote, this is more around, if you engage with the fund sort of in Washington, what would that look like? What would you look for that is coming out of the fund? And then there's also, if you are in a country yourself, those are the kind of processes like loan negotiations, or looking what kind of documents to look for, what is going to be in those documents, how you can support national level outreach, etc. All right, so I think that piece is particularly important. And again, I also would like to encourage you all, if you read through it and you are already and doing that advocacy and you have practical insights from the work that you've done, to let us know and contact us. On the resource page, you can submit your own resources here, as well as I mentioned, finding various resources on different topics. And if you go to the bottom of any page, you can contact us. So there you also would be welcome to, submit any feedback you have to the website, any additions that you think would be useful. Really welcome that. So I'm not sure I'm doing on the time. I might have like 1 more minute. So I just want to show you the IMF's Work on Climate page, which I think is particularly interesting, because it traces back questions like, that I think Lara already brought up, like, why is the fund even working on climate? How are these issues connected? Should it even be working on climate or not? A bit more details on the timeline. And then, looking particularly at what impacts does it have? And then here we don't just look at the Resilience Sustainability Trust, for example, but at different aspects of the fund. So, for example, the way it is governed, and a little more depth on this kind of austerity paradigm that I think Lara described already really well. What does it mean when we say greenwashing austerity? What does that actually look like in practice? What's the problem with carbon pricing that Lara also just brought up? What's the issue with private finance first? What are some of the alternatives? And then, also looking at debt sustainability, what does it mean? How is it connected? So diving a little deeper in this debt climate vicious cycle. So lots of content there, which I won't have time to get into, but it's also meant obviously for you to kind of, it's like a menu, right? Where you can pick and choose the issues that matter most to you, that, you feel like you would love to deepen a bit more. And also, it's really meant to be as accessible as possible. So we try to, of course, you still need to use some expert language, but we try to, make it as accessible for a kind of general readership, or for someone who's just starting to approach this work, as much as possible. So also if you have, younger colleagues or other people that might be interested to get engaged, but feel a bit apprehensive about this like economist speak, right, that always surrounds the fund, we really hope that this could be a useful resource for you as well. And with that, I hand it back to Fede.
Thank you so much, Frederica. And just for everyone, we'll be sending the link to the website as soon as it's published. It should have been published, but it will be anytime soon. And we'll send you also a follow-up email with information around how is it that you can submit also your inputs, also to submit edits, comments. The idea is for this to be a platform and to be ongoing, like to work on it ongoingly, if that's even a word. I think I made myself clear. Thank you so much. And also, again, I insist, thank you for all the people that have collaborated in this huge effort. And now let's pass on through the three presentations from our partner organizations. The first one will be from Zain. Zain Mulvi, he's a friend. He has a degree in law and policy, and he's a research director at Alternative Law Collective in Pakistan, and he will be sharing a little bit of the experience with Pakistan's arrangement under the Resilience and Sustainability Trust, which, as Frederica said, is this climate finance facility the IMF has. To call it climate finance when the IMF does not abide at all by the Paris Agreement and the UNFCCC is quite questionable, but well, that's how the OECD labels it. And also, I mean, how is it that the IMF acted in the case of the 2022 floods? I'll hand it over to you, Zain. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Fred. Thank you, Federica. I hope my screen is visible.
Yes.
Okay, thanks. So yeah, and just taking over from Federica, first, I really want to commend this incredible resource. Benefited a lot from the resources that have been collected by Federica and Federico over the years, but this one in particular, I think, is going to be incredibly significant. I want to get into why I think that's the case, and that's because how the IMF actually responds on the ground to climate crises and what they claim they're doing by way of institutional reforms and the changes that are coming in the name of climate. It's really hard sometimes to connect those two. So this growing mandate in Pakistan's case has yielded about 4 programs. In 2021 is when the IMF, first acknowledged that climate vulnerability required some kind of response. And I'm going to suggest that that response, which sets out on a timeline over the next 7 years, contrary to what Lara was suggesting, I don't think it's just austerity repackaged as climate policy. I think it's a new form of austerity on steroids. So I think some of what we're going to see is going to show why that's the case. The first of this is that indeed the business as usual fiscal paradigm is what they pushed, catalyzing private investments, concession loans, more domestic revenues through austerity. But the actual impacts of this were much different to the non-climate aligned IMF programs. So for instance, the debt to GDP ratio actually spiked by 18%. And it hit really new highs, far higher than what was going on in the previous years under IMF programs. So it seems like when they turned to climate lending and climate-based policy, that actually made things a lot worse. When Pakistan experienced that flooding, that same year, the fund chose not to release the remaining tranche under the 2018 EFF program, and they cited deviations because of subsidy reinstatements. And in order to then access that tranche, they pushed incredible amounts of currency depreciation, energy and transport price hikes, and all the rest of it. Some of these results I've just collected the information here are absolutely staggering. These were multi-year highs. I think in some cases we hadn't seen these kind of inflation numbers in 20 years and more, with 4 million souls pushed into poverty. And right about the same time, they also attempted to tax solar panels that were at the heart of this sort of people's-led revolution towards energy sovereignty and self-management, and even gave public finance and subsidies for coal and hydropower projects. And I should point out that Pakistan's own National Adaptation Program points out that it was precisely during that year and because of the IMF's responses that public spending for climate and public development was slashed by more than half. And debt servicing is the reason. Now, one of the things that was mentioned, I think Laura rightly pointed out that the DSAs are hugely significant, both for like signaling to private markets and also more generally for the local authorities. But in the IMF's case with Pakistan, when they actually integrated climate into the DSAs, things went really bad. So very quickly, the optimism bias, which is self-admitted, by the way, in this program, in these 2 of the recent programs, the actual forecast was something like 67% is what your debt to GDP ratio will be, and in fact, what obtained was something like 90%. Pakistan was basically pushed to the point of default. Debt servicing continues to this year account for 46.7% of the federal budget. And that same year, the country spent 11 times more on debt servicing than on actual development. That's during the flood year. Now, they claim they've incorporated climate into the DSAs. When you actually look at what they've done, it's appalling. The adaptation costs that they've estimated into what the debt, what the impact for debt sustainability will be, is taken at 0.6% of GDP annually, whereas the actual figure is closer to 20%, according to the World Bank figures. Mitigation never even featured. And when you look at that, it actually takes you over to 110%. These are some figures to show you how the debt and liabilities have shifted. This is when climate loans start up, so 2018, 2019, and you can see an immediate shift in the debt to GDP ratios. The debt servicing costs are even worse. This is perhaps some of the most staggering shifts and rises we've seen. So this is why I'm categorizing it as austerity on steroids. This is around about the time when those climate conditionalities obtain, and immediately you see spikes that are, absolutely unimaginable at this point. You know, the inflation and GDP growth, it's a classic crocodile jaws graph with the inflation rising just as you see GDP growth going down. So the real problem here is that there isn't even any growth in the happening during this period. So it's not just the austerity problem, it's stunted growth. And so you're not even being able to spend, you're also having to service your debt increasingly, and there's a growth problem that's playing out. That same crocodile graph here playing out in terms of interest developments and developmental spending. Again, where climate conditionalities get introduced, you begin to see that massive drop off on developmental spending and that massive rise in interest payments. And inflation is even worse. I should point out one thing about this. So when you get into the 2022, you can see immediately the housing, water, electricity, and food rises. Now, food, you'll notice, drops off, and that's because Pakistan reinstated some of the agricultural subsidies, but the RSF is now forcing us to push those back out again as well. So what we're seeing really is now a new paradigm, and the RSF, which was supposed to, liberate us and deliver us from the climate problem, is actually creating a whole new set of dimensions of austerity and the crisis they bring with it. So aside from energy and petrol, we are now going to see the same kind of austerity with water management and water-related concerns. I've put here some of the things that are happening. Remember, Lara was mentioning these issues in relation to sort of carbon pricing and this investor-friendly and investor confidence-oriented concerns. And so the IMF has done all of that by introducing Pakistan's green taxonomy. And the result of that green taxonomy is that we now consider gas to be a green fuel. Hydropower, which is incredibly ecologically risky, is scaled up. Carbon pricing and de-risking are measures, but we have absolutely no frameworks for it, nor is it meant to be something that will help in the sense of actual public risks going down. And green grabs have grown, especially with indigenous forests and land types. The same is true also of the energy sector, where energy subsidies are being reversed and carbon levies are being imposed. And these levies and solar tax panels are now going to be taxed again. And these levies, by the way, apply precisely to petrol that is going into bikes and cars and everyday average consumers in vulnerable communities. Meanwhile, the coal and hydropower again gets tax incentives. And so this kind of this internal inconsistency and contradictory kind of within them as well, within the program itself. And finally, water is now set to become another topic where tariff increases and revenue collection measures are going to be implemented. And that's going to really stress staple food items, their price, and then the question of water disputes. Pakistan is an incredibly water-stressed land. And so the hydropower and this particular measure is actually going to create a lot of disputes. Just some parting thoughts on why this particular website is really significant. I think it's very important. And the reason is that some of the technical and analytic things that are going on, and remember the claims that the IMF has made is that it's including climate into all of its analytic and other operations. And what we are seeing is that those claims and what happens in those rooms and what gets discussed in in boardrooms and in the media, the way they actually translate into on-ground action demonstrates that there are some analytic aspects that we need to perhaps be pushing for and looking towards. For instance, increasing trade-off analysis need to be done, distributional impacts and welfare losses, harms assessments. And then this Paris question, the question of how does Paris apply to the IMF when it claims to be a climate champion? Where is CBDR in all these strategies of financing that they're including? And so I'm going to suggest that a massive overhaul is needed, and the kind of watchdogging that is going on right now with Federico, with you folks, is incredibly significant. And I hope it translates into more more interest in the nitty-gritties of how all of this comes to play out in on-the-ground impacts for countries like Pakistan. So thanks, folks. Over to you.
Thank you so much, Zane. I think, another takeaway of how, the need to discuss how is it that climate policies and climate finance is implemented and designed rather than just for it to be a blank check. I'll now hand it over to Julia, who is part of the research team at FARN in Argentina, also a friend, holds a bachelor in political science and a master in urban economics, and she'll go through Argentina's experience with the IMF arrangement and the entrenchment of fossil fuel extraction for debt repayment, and also the current political context. How is it that the IMF has actually reinforced the climate denial party that is in power right now? Julia, please go ahead.
Okay, thank you, Fede. Thank you for the invitation and congratulations for this. Can you see my screen? Yeah. I will put it just a minute here. Congratulations for this initiative. I think that is a result of a collective effort through this year. So it's great to be here. In my presentation, I will try to keep myself on time, but in my presentation, I will unfortunately share the experience in this critical conversation with the IMF and climate. And I also would like to share some point of the state of the situation with the country. As many of you know, Argentina has a long and complex relationship with the fund. To date, Argentina has undergone with a 21 loans program, and exceptional access is a recurring theme, with the country being the largest user of the fund resource since 2018. It can here you can, as you can see in this graph, this is updated to 2025. Argentina is one of the biggest borrower of the fund, and it can sound incredible, but the IMF provide a new external fund facility agreement this year, totaling $20 billion, which represents more or less around 400% of the Argentina quotes. And what is shocking is that 60% of this loan was disbursed immediately upon approval of the agreement. This, the IMF again state that is unprecedented for the institution, and the agreement, of course, that was made to support the current far-right administration in the country. The agreement wasn't passed by the Congress and ignored many international law, many national internal law of the country, and was approved by a presidential decree. In this context, we have been following the different IMF agreement and technical notes. This agreement, as Fede mentioned before, is basically built on a fossil fuel boost, and of course the other leg, fiscal adjustment. The IMF is not a neutral institution, as Lara said at the beginning. It shaped the different national development model, and in this regard, they put Global South countries as a zone where they are meant to provide undervalued environmental good to the international system. In this context, Argentina is expected to increase, as you can see here from the last technical note of the agreement, is meant to increase, to rise the exportation of fossil fuel extraction, particularly in the zone of Vaca Muerta. For the next years, the agreement basically relies on the foreign currency from this exportation, and also from mining exportation. In this regard, what is the cost? What is the cost for the country? Lots of water contamination, earthquake, toxic waste, an increase in socio-environmental conflictivity around this zone, and this for us, this create what we call a zone of sacrifice, where communities surrounded of these extractivist projects are the most affected, the most affected from this kind of policies. And of course, this clash directly with the Argentinian climate commitment under the Paris Agreement and human rights international obligation. The other, of course, while fossil fuel extraction is being fast-tracked for and endorsed by the fund, the other leg is the fiscal adjustment. I don't know how is the time, but I don't want to go deeper on this, but I list all the budget items that were cut during the last year in the country as part of the fiscal adjustment strategy. For example, all the policies related with gender, environment, education, health, and all the public policies related with the social well-being were reduced and were financed by the current administration, the far-right administration of Milei. Here, for example, the Ministry of Women, Gender and Diversity was closed, the Ministry of Environment and Sustainable Development was demoted, and some of the budget items experienced a huge reduction. If I talk, for example, about renewable incentive or adaptation and mitigation policies, they were completely dismantled, while the only budget item that is being prioritized is the debt item, and the debt interest and the interest with the fund. Finally, this agreement, as I mentioned before, represent, again, is exceptional, represent around 400% of the Argentina quota, and this is a way to support this ideological right-wing presence in Argentina. Even in the I put some note from the last revision, from the last technical note of the fund. Even they state that the fund credit to Argentina is projected to peak above 1,000% of the quota, which will be the largest exposure in the history of the fund in absolute terms. The agreement and the level, the level of Argentina, of the Argentinian debt with the institution is even incredible for the fund situation, and pose the fund in a unique and elevated financial risk. And I think that as we say in already state, I think that Argentina case is not an exception, or yes, a little, but I think that it's a part of broader pattern in which the IMF promote extractivist growth and put global South countries into this model of prioritizing the services under social and environmental well-being. And as Lara, I think that mentioned, is it's act as a gatekeeper, and in this sense is the guardian of the current system that is being more and more involved in climate funds, in climate finance. And I think that it's important to recognize that the fund didn't pay a minimal attention in their macroeconomic analysis in the impact of fossil fuel expansion in our countries, and in the impact of the different extractivist activities that is being promoted under each agreement. That is from my side, and I share stop my screen, and thank you, Fede, again for the space.
Thank you so much, Juli. I think two quick takeaways. One is, I think it's a perfect example of what Lara mentioned at the beginning around how is it that IMF programs are designed for the creditor's interest to ensure the prepayment. And this tragic story of what happens in Argentina, of how is it that both, I think the two big pillars of the program are the acceleration of extractivism and also austerity. And I'm sure Shireen will build up on those as she presents. Also, thank you for being here. Also a friend, and she's an Egyptian feminist economist, climate justice advocate, documentary filmmaker. She's based in Morocco, and she's a founder and director of MenaFem for Economic, Ecological Justice and Development, MenaFem. She will be presenting around Egypt, also about all the work that she's been leading with various organizations all throughout the world. So Shireen, the floor is all yours.
Thanks a lot, Federico, and thanks a lot for all my colleagues who already presented. And while Julia was presenting, and Zain, it's very obvious how similar the programs and the measures and the policies that is repackaging austerity and debt for us around the world, not only in the MENA region or Africa or in LAC, but everywhere. So I'm sorry, my presentation, I have a technical problem. It's not opening, so allow me to accept just me to present. And in here, I am presenting the Egypt case, but I want first to say that we are launching today a platform that is very important in having access to information, but also challenging the IMF climate agenda through the lens of justice and real world impact. So I hope everybody can contribute, and let me speak about Egypt here. So since 2016, Egypt has entered 4 IMF loans engagements. Yani 4 IMF loan engagements, that's a lot to a country like Egypt. As of 2024, Egypt became the second largest borrower from the fund after Argentina. Over this time, Egypt's external debt tripled, soaring from $46 million to $168 billion. $46 billion to $168 billion. And what we did get in return, the GDP declined, the Egyptian pound collapsed, inflation exploded, poverty demanded, labor force participation dropped, and all of that under the name of reform. These policies didn't fail implementation, they failed design on the first stage. Austerity was repackaged as reform, as I mentioned earlier. Climate action was repackaged as subsidy cuts, and people paid the price. Between 2014 and 2021, the IMF pushed Egypt to remove energy subsidies, which had provided essential support to the poor. This alone generated around 5.4% of GDP in fiscal savings, but only 0.07% of that was redirected to pensions. Food prices more than doubled. The conditional cash transfer covered only half the eligible poor and didn't keep up with inflation, which hit around 81% for the poorest. For the extreme poor, energy costs made up for around 35.7% of their increased expenses. And for the rich, just 21.5%. This wasn't, of course, climate justice. It was class warfare disguised as climate policy. Let's also talk about the IMF's green claims under the Resilience and Sustainability Trust. Egypt received around 3 billion, but no meaningful investment went to renewables. No support reached small farmers, and no adaptation finance flowed to frontline communities. Instead, energy-intensive industries like mining and construction grew. They received most of the foreign direct investments. طبعا reflecting that the IMF claimed that the higher energy prices would reduce emissions, which is we call it a false solution. In short, green policies failed to be green. They were extractive. They hurt the poor, and they left the country more vulnerable. And where did the borrowed money go? It's a big question. It went to major projects, military consolidation, and regime survival, not public welfare, not climate resilience. Civil society also voices was crushed because of the a non-democratic state, if we may say. Basic freedoms was stripped, and the protest was also punished. Compare this to Tunisia and Jordan, where people forced governments to reverse IMF imposed fuel prices. Heck, in Egypt, civic space is so limited, resistance is unfortunately silenced. And as we say that the IMF backed reform that didn't just ignore political repression, they worsen it. So the result of those programs year after year from 2016 till today, even with the Resilience and the Sustainability Fund, the result was debt exploded, services crumbled, climate policy greenwashed. And here's also a big question that our colleague Fiona in the chat already raised. Now the bank and the fund have restricted guidance not to speak about climate anymore, just call it weather, whatever. So I don't know how we are going to navigate this, and I know how we are going to navigate this, but it's a question for us all to answer. I mean, that is not calling the cause by the issue by its names means that you don't see it and you deny it. So whatever programs that is happening under what they are called green, and as we all see that it was more like greenwashing than green, I don't know what will be the upcoming result of the new renaming the policies itself. But going back to what we are having here, Egypt was not an exception. Egypt, what is happening in Egypt is a warning, and I believe what we can benefit from a website like this that we're launching today is putting and bringing the evidence together that tell us the truth behind the IMF climate finance, not only in the MENA region but around the global South in particular, and the global programs, if we may say, and giving voices to communities and activists to use this and to understand through researches, and to relate austerity measures, debt to climate. And it's not enough to say do no harm to the IMF, because the IMF is doing already harm. It must be held accountable to. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Shireen, and thank you for start posing this question on how is it that, I mean, I think also quickly for context, for everyone that may have the luck not to be following all the developments that the United States government by the spring meetings in April clearly stated what's their stance on how is it that the IMF should change in these upcoming policy reviews, the surveillance review and the conditionalities review. The managing director that was before climate leader for some outlets, not for us. She would speak all the time about climate, and now climate is a non-existent issue, which is quite surprising, and yes, speaks a lot about the absolute accountability of the institution. Now I'll thank you again, Shireen. We'll have time to discuss this. I'll hand it over to Mariana. She's a global advocacy lead at Christian Aid, based in Brighton, but from Brazil. Also a friend, and she'll be going a little bit through the different international policy processes. How is it that's, I mean, what is it, where is it that we can get discussion around what's going on? And yes, I'll hand it over to you, Mariana. I think you're the largest expert here on how is it that all of these processes are linked with one another.
Have we lost Mariana?
Let me message her.
Yep. I'm happy to check with her if you wanted to maybe look at some of the questions in the chat. Maybe we can
yes,
answer
I
some
think.
of them.
I mean, I think this question that came up on this context and how to position ourselves around this question, on like, I mean, there's we're really good at showing the evidence on what's problematic about how the IMF is doing this work. This discussion right now is being opened up, not by our allies, I would say by our enemies, which of course provides the opportunity to have a strategic rethinking on how is that we approach this. I think the evidence is there. And it's quite a daunting moment, I think, to discuss all of these international financial monetary system issues. Someone was speaking in the chat about the implications of a weaker dollar. What is it that is going to happen? I mean, what is it that we should do as civil society with the IMF? Should we engage with it? Is it legitimate to engage with an institution that is doing all the harm that it's doing in name of positive outcomes, supposedly? Will the IMF become stronger as countries become, I mean, as the world becomes increasingly more shock prone, whether it's for climate crisis, wars, and all the terrible things that we're seeing? I'll keep the questions though, because I'll hand it over to Mariana now, and then we'll have a round from everyone in the floor. So please add your comments and questions. Thank you, Mariana.
Great, thank you so much, and apologies for my disconnection momentaneously. So let me share my screen. What I would like to do is just to take us with some quick reflections on the IMF and these other processes, especially linking with the FFD and UNFCCC outcomes. And it all goes back to the core of the question, which is how the current international financial architecture was designed and who controls it. So the biggest challenge that we have in common, and we look at it on the all IMF structures and others, is actually it has been a system designed by the powerful only, all the Bretton Woods institutions back in 1945. So when we look at the governance structures and we look at what the whole financing for development process meant, it would have been a great opportunity to really bring the conversation about structural economical issues like the debt, tax, trade, etc., to a more democratic space where all countries have equal vote. So, it's a bigger chance to really challenge the economic decisions and have economic decisions that actually benefit the global south. So essentially, should have been a time to really deal with the undemocratic, ineffective global economic governance, which are built on colonial legacies. But when we look at what the outcomes of the FFD process really meant, well, first, they were agreed 2 weeks in advance with little room for negotiations in Seville itself. So they really vague and missed a lot of the ambition from that front. And as non-binding outcomes, then the Seville became much more like a temperature check on what's likely to be brought forward and what not. And that's really I think throughout the process, the language to a much more ambitious transformation started in the beginning of the negotiations, in the first PrepCom last year. But throughout the process, the UK, the EU, the US, a number of developed countries have consistently done all they could to really do a race to the bottom, to dilute, to weaken the outcomes of the document through the 7 areas, and including on the governance and issues linked with climate. So let's just go to the next slide. So I think one thing that we have to reflect is why the IMF has been, it's structured like this, and I think it's fostering a lot of the problems we identified here for climate in terms of the whole austerity agenda. Who's this benefiting? It's not by accident, it's by design, because we have really developed countries calling the shots. When you look at the current unequal vote share on the IMF, we look at the US majority with the veto power. We look at the 46 sub-Saharan African countries with 4.6% of the votes. We look at the almost a non-existent percentage of the smallest developing countries, which puts them in a much more challenging situation to have the right type of the quality and the quantity of the finance and climate finance needed. And therefore, what I think what Laura was describing, the whole debt trap cycle is embedded on that structure. So that's why I really want to underscore the governance aspect of FFD here, connecting with FFD and its implications, therefore, also to the COP30 and UNFCCC. So just to have a quick look on the FFD outcomes on debt, of course, the main call is for the UN debt convention, UN debt framework on to address the architecture, which wasn't really agreed. What we got was much more a weaker language around a process to continue to the discussion to address the gaps on international debt. Much weaker than what we expected, but still an avenue to build some global debt system. Also, a bit of consensus to have the legislation on the role of private creditors, which is really important because most of the debt issues are not really addressed. And I think interestingly, by mid-2026, the IMF needs to come up with a paper since September this year, the IMF is coming up with a paper on the role of private creditors on debt. So could be an influence for the good or the bad or the bad. We have also the debtors country club. So would it mean they would be in a better position to negotiate their debt moving forward? And the IMF is also hosting, together with the bank and the UNSG, this a working group on designing principles for responsible borrowing and lending And there is also the establishment of global debt registry, outcomes on debt swaps, which are also present in the UNFCCC space. So I think the main issue that we have to look moving forward is to what extent the current initiatives under the IMF, especially with the DSF review and the conditionality review, how this will play out with FFD. Now, the other thing I wanted to highlight is on the governance issues. I think there is some space to continue the conversation on reforms. There is the 17th quarter reform is not due until 2028, but I think, yeah, by next year, some of the principles for that should be put in place already, which could be good. There was the request for the IMF to design the SDR playbook. We could, in theory, support countries to do more for their debt, but the big question is to what extent it will or will not be useful. And I think this outcome around the annual dialogue on the credit rating agencies, again, much weaker than what was was asked before in terms of having a public credit rating agency wasn't met. However, these are, I think, spaces for further avenue on these issues. So moving forward, I think the other climate outcomes under the FFD that we have seen, for example, the CBDR being diluted and now just brought to the chapeau, the illusion of there was strong language around the quality of finance and the quantity of finance also being diluted. Fossil fuel subsidies references are removed from the text, the final text, and just some mentions around other UNFCCC funds, the Green Climate Fund, loss and damage, etc. One of the big trends that we have to watch for, and I'm glad that the toolkit is really going through in more details about what are the issues on private finance and private sector first approaches, is because the over-reliance on private funds to deliver was cross-cutting. It's in fact cross-cutting also within UNFCCC, which is shifting the conversation not about what developed countries need to provide in terms of their climate debt, but maybe how to blame developing countries not for doing enough to creating the enabling environments for the de-risking, etc., to attract private finance when it knows it doesn't work because it puts profits before needs. It's problematic because it's insufficient and limited for mitigation, neglects adaptation, and it's completely inadequate for loss and damage. And within that, how the climate finance will be delivered, then both FFD as well as when you look at the Baku outcomes on COP29 and FCCC is really beefing up the role of IFIs to deliver the climate finance, and within that it comes all the conditionalities that we've been talking about, with all the wrong models that actually are doing more harm than good. So I think, yeah, these are the common problems that we'll have to address moving forward. I think when it comes to COP30, when you look at what is needed to implement the non-intensive QG decision, the new collective quantified goal, now there is a roadmap from Baku to Berlin being discussed. And because there's so little or nothing really secured in terms of public finance within that means the debt trap will continue. It means we might have more debt in the form of climate finance, and this is one of our biggest risks. So it's really important that we continue to do cross advocacy between the climate and economic justice movement and some of the common avenues. I think the debt sustainability framework review and the conditionality reviews are good avenues for that. As I said, there was this paper on the role of private creditors and the IMF principles for redistribution on governance next year, which could be really, really good. For me, one of the biggest takeaways, going back to the core of the question on the governance and why taking decision making out of the hands of developed countries, democratizing economic decision making is essential for the quality and the quantity of climate finance moving forward. Is because if developing countries are not at the table, they are on the menu. And this is exactly what we have been watching through all those implementations of the IMF policy throughout. Yeah, and with that, I'll finish. Yeah, thank you.
Thank you, Mariana. Now we'll use the last 10 minutes for some of the questions and also to do the tableau with the speakers. I mean, I think there are some questions, or various questions, some are quite systemic. I think there's one for Lara on the implications of a weaker dollar on beneficiary countries and IMF borrowers. Another question by Fiana on what I was mentioning before about what are the implications of this new approach inside the IMF of this call not to mention climate explicitly, even though the institution is continuing to work on climate with new RSTs in Pakistan, in Egypt. They are not doing publicly. So what are the implications of that? Like, how is it that we can navigate this delicate balance between wanting the institution to change how it does things, but at the same time somehow wanting them to continue working on them? A question from Alison on CBDR that somehow already touched upon. I think I will do like 1 minute if possible for each speaker, and then we can wrap up with some reactions and ideas about the way forward. Quite ambitious, I know, but let's try. I'll hand it over to Lara first.
So then I have to speak really fast. But on the, weaker dollar, I think it actually ties into a lot of the other things we discussed, because it's really about the volatility in the system, right? So right now the dollar is a little weaker. It actually still is not as weak as it was before the Fed started raising interest in 2022. So it's kind of something that illustrates how, Federal Reserve policy and what the US does affects the debt servicing costs of the rest of the world a lot. So it's like, now the dollar is a little weaker, more investment, and the financing costs for the rest of the world get a little lower. But then the moment this shifts, that becomes way more expensive to service. And I think it's important to realize that a lot of like the increase in these debt ratios and debt that we see after 2022 is just because the US increased interest rates. It significantly increased the cost of servicing debt, which made it more expensive for everyone, even though those countries didn't do anything differently, which is also kind of something about how important it is to flip the narrative that debt problems are the debtor country's problem. But yeah, I think with this, I'm gonna like end here, but it's all, part of, even if like this is an external problem, there's no way to restructure the debt, because you go to the IMF and you have a program where they're okay with you spending like half your revenue on debt service. And it's very unlikely that they will let you restructure. And if they will, it's gonna be like really the too little too late.
Thank you, Lara. And we'll also make sure in the follow-up that we share some of the excellent pieces that you've written on various of these issues. I'll now hand it over to Friederike. I think there's a question that you could answer on who are the key decision makers we should engage for our IMF campaign efforts. Would it be strategic to collaborate with ministries of finance or other shareholders?
I'm really happy to yield my time also to the other speakers, which I think are more interesting. I think, it really depends, right, on also the level of advocacy that you do, whether it's, country-based or at HQ level. Definitely, it's always strategic to engage ministries of finance. The engagement structures can be quite different, right? We heard from Shireen about the context in Egypt, where it's a lot more difficult in terms of civic space compared to other countries. But I think, if you look into the guide, there's always a series of documents coming out on each country that are important to follow. They're on the level of the HQ, right? Countries and constituencies have different executive directors. that are worth engaging with. Usually ministries of finance and will have representatives at the fund, even if there's no executive director for each country. So I think it's worth, finding out basically for your local context who's holding the pen. From the fund side, usually even though it's quite difficult to find the contacts of individuals, unlike the World Bank, which is a lot more transparent in that regard, all of the Article 4 reports, for example, for each country usually have a list of the authors and of the people that were part of the mission. So that's a way of starting to dig kind of who are the people from the fund side that are coming to my country. And then many also have resident representatives where the fund has kind of a local office as well. So those are starting points to kind of start digging and finding out who to talk to. But yeah, it can be quite different based on the context. In any case, I think the guide is a really good starting point to kind of signpost that a little bit of where to find what and which information. But also, again, really happy to receive feedback there from your own experiences in country contexts, right? And if you read the guide and you feel like it doesn't reflect your experience or you have something to add that could be helpful for your fellow advocates, around the world, would really appreciate your inputs.
Thank you so much. And Zane, 1 minute maximum for reactions.
All right, yeah, I'll try. I have to agree, but on the question, because it names Ministry of Finance, so within the IMF, I think it's fairly clear. Recourse does a really good job of, disaggregating, distinguishing between players that can be long-term allies and long-term conversations and so on. We found that the country resident missions are not a very good allies, or not really reasonable in terms of expecting much, though this might change a little bit. But I do want to respond quickly to the Ministries of Finance question, because in a country like Pakistan, it actually works against you. The Ministries of Finance are typically the most close-minded, the most like-thinking in terms of the traditional, IMF type technocratism, and added layers of bureaucratic sort of superciliousness, and they look down upon legislators and representatives. And so what we've been trying to do is to target more the elected representatives, and within self-style committees within, for instance, the senators and within the parliament. And I don't know if it's going to pay off, but it certainly is creating sort of like a lot more awareness and grounds for sort of future engagement. So I hope that gives one sense of how we're thinking about this, Pakistan.
Thank you so much, Zane. Julia?
Yes, one last comment about all the panel. I was thinking I think that in the moment we are in a kind of crossroad, because global south country, in my case, I would say like Argentina is going to the fund over and over and over again. And I think that it's very difficult to challenge this institution to take whether they have a mandate of macroeconomic stability, and in this mandate they are working with gender, with climate, with the social side. So in this regard, I would like to highlight that I think that the IMF is not the best institution to work on climate, and from civil society movement, we should point out that. But at the same time, the international context is so regressive. And again, our government are the ones who are going to the fund, as Lara said, as a gatekeeper for resource, for private, for more public, and for more money, basically. So I think that we are in a crossroad at the moment.
And Shireen, would you like to guide us out of this crossroad in less than 1 minute?
Yeah, I just want to say that, especially after the FFD, and it's very clear where we are going forward to what's happening in the state and the result of the FFD. And I believe we need to be more critical. I mean, I'm not afraid of the word radical. We have to be more radical. And I'm here speaking about researchers, academia, civil society activists, etc. Because we cannot accept, while our people are dying from climate change, to change the narrative to around weather events. It will harm any kind of structural work on that. This is first. Second, governance and governance and governance. Governance is the key issue and the answer of it all. The governance of this global economical system, including the IMF, it's not about reform. It's more about now transform this system. It's not working anymore, and I don't think that us keeping pushing this system in the same way is going to do anything. We have to be more bold and to put our narrative on the table. And by this, I'm not saying boycotting. They are here. They are our part of the reality, the day-to-day that is impacting our life. So we have to be on the table till they vanish, inshallah. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Shireen. And Mariana, please go ahead.
Okay, 30 seconds. I just think there is quite a bit we can do in terms of cross collaboration between the climate and economic justice groups working together on that agenda. A lot we do is about damage control if we can. So going a bit beyond thinking in terms of those, advocacy moments that we have with the springs and annuals, but really like connecting the dots with other moments as well, and especially in the whole debt and climate conversation. So just to say congratulations again for the wonderful website. And yeah, I'm looking forward to collaborate a lot more on those fronts. Thank you.
Thank you, everyone, for joining. We will be sending you the link to the website as soon as we have it on a nice follow-up email with lots of resources. And yes, I will also keep you posted about these upcoming discussions for civil society to engage in the policy reviews that the IMF is undergoing. But also, I mean, this is a call for us to mobilize and to do cross-movement work. I mean, the people that are fighting in the streets in Kenya, in Buenos Aires, in Lahore, in Cairo, everything is on climate justice, it's economic justice, it's social justice, it's feminist justice. So we should be together. And as Shireen said, we shouldn't shy away of being more radical and more ambitious, because from the other side, they're being quite ambitious. Thank you so much. Speak soon.
Okay, thanks for organizing this and for joining. Bye.
Bye-bye.
Thank you. Bye.